When I started researching this particular video, Sam Raimi's latest film was just out in cinemas. The very highly enjoyable, if I do say so myself, Send Help. And I imagine if you are around my age, I can imagine that the first Sam Raimi film that you may have seen was something not Evil Dead or Darkman, but the original Spider-Man trilogy starring Tobey Maguire. So let's thwip our way through some of the history of Spider-Man, how those films were developed, and then take a look at how real spiders make real life spiders' webs in this lecture from Science After Hours. I'm sure the vast majority of people watching an online science lecture about the webhead are incredibly familiar with the real life origins of the character. But if you're not, the Amazing Fantasy line of comics wasn't doing too well, and so was fertile ground for Stan Lee, the often sidelined Steve Ditko, and likely collaboration from Jack Kirby to test new ground for a teenage superhero, one who was the star of their very own book rather than a sidekick to an older, more mature hero, a la Batman and Robin. This one-off hero in Amazing Fantasy number 15 in 1962 has now gone to have hundreds of different comic book series, multiple incarnations, and has appeared in tens of thousands of individual issues. And this, of course, is Spider-Man. And with this success comes the opportunity for expansion away from the page and onto the big screen. In the 1990s though, Marvel was not doing so well financially and filed for bankruptcy and emerged from this state in 1998, but prior to this, film rights to Spider-Man were being passed around through sales and mergers like nobody's business, but ultimately Marvel had to pay up to settle the vast number of legal disputes, and how this was done, by and large, was selling off a lot of its character licenses to various movie studios. This was of course how we ended up with Marvel movies from Fox, from Universal, and importantly for us today, Sony ended up with the Spider-Man rights for a reported sum of $7 million, which is equivalent to just under $14 million in today's money. And Sony will maintain these rights for as long as they release a Spider-Man related movie every 5 years. It has been 2 years since Kraven, but we do have Beyond the Spider-Verse next year to save us from another highly mediocre to poor origin movie. As you might imagine, Sam Raimi was not the favourite to direct Sony's big new purchase, with the last superhero film he directed, 1990's Darkman starring Liam Neeson, was more of a cult hit and certainly not the big business that Sony would have been looking for here. But here's the thing, Sam Raimi loves comic books, and this passion was reportedly enough to convince some of the funders that he was the one. Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst were brought on board in 2000, and the film was ultimately released in May of 2002 to massive financial success, cementing a new age of superhero movies after the release of the first X-Men movie in the year 2000. But the major separation between this Peter Parker and the Peter Parker of comic books and his other film outings is the organic web shooters, a carryover from an early James Cameron script that Sam Raimi thought was more believable than a teenager being able to make the chemicals himself. Commonly, Peter designs a web fluid he loads into launchers that allow him to swing through the skylines of New York, but this Peter Parker shoots the webs from within himself, making him very much more spider-like than other incarnations of the character. But before we try and figure out how Peter Parker might make these organic webs, let's see how nature gets it done. Now, I'm not going to lie, when I had this idea, I had no idea how complex the structure and biology of spider silk could possibly be, but I can tell you now that my eyes have been opened incredibly wide, and I will try to relay my studies back to you in the most understandable way I possibly can. And probably the most important thing to get out of the way is that there isn't just one type of silk. There are 7 made in different glands that have different functions and are utilised in different circumstances. So we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about protein structure, but luckily for you, I have a video on just that, and I'll put a link to it in the description below if you do need a bit of revision, or want to learn how the PlayStation 3 was used to uncover protein structures, because that is ultimately what that video is about. But back to spiders. Like all proteins, spider silk proteins have an N-terminus at one end and a C-terminus at the other, and the amino acid sequences are highly conserved between spider species, i.e. the sequences are the same, if not very similar, amongst different types of spiders. But between the two termini are larger, highly repetitive, unconserved regions of amino acids consisting mostly of alanine and glycine, maybe some proline, as well as some triads of 2 glycine residues and another amino acid. It is this variability that gives rise to different secondary structures of proteins, either forming 310 helices, anti-parallel beta sheets, or beta angles, and the combination of all of this produces those 7 types of spider silk that I just mentioned, with the different classes of silk having different lengths of repetitive regions, and those repetitive regions having different sequences as the most common. Dragline silk comes in a major and minor form, the former being used to construct the outer rim of a web and the larger spokes, as well as the web that is fired to catch the spider should it fall or find itself in a place that it doesn't want to be. The minor form is then used to fill in the gaps between these stronger fibres to complete the web. Made in the major ampullate gland, the major dragline silk consists of combinations of 5 spiderin MASP proteins, and which are rich in glycine, with a repetitive region that leads to the formation of anti-parallel beta sheets that provide these silks with very high tensile strength. MASP2 also has a lot of these beta turns, which increases flexibility and ductility, so that's the ability to malform before breaking and thus increasing strength. MASPs 3 to 5 are more recent discoveries via proteomic and genomic analysis, and thus their effects on the silk are less well understood, but are thought to modulate the toughness of the silk fibres ultimately produced. Minor dragline silk, made in the minor ampullate gland as you might imagine, is made up of MISP proteins, of which there are reported 2 isoforms appropriately named MISP1 and MISP2. Like MASPs, these often take the form of anti-parallel beta sheets, though considerably shorter than their MASP counterparts, alongside some of those 310 helices. These ultimately decrease their overall strength, but exhibit higher extensibility upon stress. That is, they can be pulled to increase the length, but unlike elasticity, will not spring back to their original conformation. So this might be why when you head outside after some heavy wind, you see a lot of those larger floppy spiders' webs. It's likely that these minor dragline silks have been stretched out. Now imagine if you're a spider and you've constructed this large web on which to live, but all this hard work has left you pretty hungry. That's where the flagelliform and the aciniform silk, produced by the flagellate and aciniform glands respectively, come into play. The flagelliform silk is used for the initial capture of prey, with its continuous GGX motifs providing proteins with a large amount of beta helix structures, thereby giving flagella filaments high elasticity and 200% extensibility to initially envelop the target and make it difficult to escape. Following this is the aciniform silk, which is some of the most rigid, as of course you don't want your prey squirming around and ultimately getting away. This silk type also contains a greater ratio of other amino acids not seen in other silk classes, such as serine and leucine and valine, which suggests that there are properties of this silk that are not currently fully understood, but it's thought that they could be linked to the efficient breakdown of the trapped prey within. So you've made your home and you've had a snack, so now of course it's time to have some babies. Well, luckily for you as a spider, your ovary gland and your tubuliform gland mature at the very same time, and therefore it is unsurprising that the tubuliform silk protein is what is used to make egg sacs. This silk type is the least flexible, with the lowest tensile strength of the bunch, but that's of use when you want an egg that's hard enough to protect what lies within. Interestingly though, the tubuliform silk is also incredibly rich in sulfur and contains long repetitive units, approximately 200 amino acid residues, highly unique amongst the silk fibres, and again highlights just how specific these different fibre types are to their function. and indeed the last silk is the piiform silk, which again has a unique structure that promotes aggregation and self-assembly of the proteins that make it up, which is why this silk type is used to anchor the web to structures of non-web based origin. Let's pivot back to Peter Parker briefly, because I think it's safe to say from everything that we've just discussed that it must be dragline silk that he produces. It has to have a large enough tensile strength and significant degree of elasticity to be able to support swinging through that New York skyline, as well as to throw the criminal element of the city of New York around. Ergo, this incarnation of Peter Parker must have an ampullate gland within his forearms to produce these dragline variants. But how are we going to get from liquid silk that is made internally to the robust fibres we see him swing on? For that, we've of course got to go back to the science of spiders. There are currently two competing theories as to how we get the silk from the liquid phase to the fibres, the micelle theory and the liquid crystal theory. In the latter, it has been suggested that the storage conditions within the spider leave the fibres arranged with their long axis parallel to one another, and during fibre formation along the spinning duct, the individual molecules that make up the spider's silk undergo ion exchange, as well as experience a gradual pH drop, water removal, and elongation flow, resulting in beta sheet rich nanofibrils. Opposingly, the micelle theory claims that the dimeric spiderin molecules assemble into micelles due to being both hydrophilic and hydrophobic under the storage conditions in the ampulla gland. So the hydrophobic interactions keep the outside and the hydrophobic domains hidden within these spherical structures. These micelles then cluster into larger condensates, which are then elongated and compressed as they pass through the spinning duct. And just as in the other theory, they experience a pH decrease, ion exchange and water removal that then results in these beta sheet rich nanofibrils. Ultimately, regardless of how they got there, the last step involves the transfer of the liquid-like nanofibrils to a solid state by drawing the silk thread through the exit spigot. Basically, the force involved pressurizes the liquid into that solid state. This is the web. So this is even more biological machinery that Peter Parker has to have in his wrist and his forearm, but without it he would just be spraying a sticky white liquid from his arms, which could lead to some rather substantial misunderstandings with the people of New York City. Hopefully this lecture has highlighted the sheer complexity of spider silk, and this is why scientists in the world that we live in have really struggled to produce synthetic materials that have the majority of the properties of natural spider silk. So maybe Sam Raimi was right in stating that it's even more unbelievable that Peter Parker makes spider silk in a lab rather than from within himself. But should scientists working on this succeed, we could be in for some major shifts in medical care for the better. So from one scientist to another, I really do wish them the very best of luck. Thank you for watching. And if you've made it this far, again, thank you for watching. The references are hopefully scrolling up the screen if I've timed this correctly. My channel is still very, very small and it's certainly very niche. So I appreciate anyone and everyone who watches, especially this far into the video. You can follow the channel on Instagram at Science After Hours. I think the link is in the description. You can join us on Sundays for some lively live streams. Currently playing through Pokemon Unbound at the moment, but who knows when you might be watching this video. Probably not playing Pokemon Unbound anymore. But again, thank you for watching.